Okay, today we are going to start chapter 10. So first notice that chapter 10 has 4 lessons and the years are going to be about 1800 to 1816, which they're loosely calling the Jefferson era. All right, and then if you go switch to the next page, you will see the map. Notice that we're going to be talking about Louisiana Purchase in this chapter and how we are slowly moving west, acquiring more land. You can see some of the territories we've talked about before. They're starting to switch into states now. All right, and then on the next page, here we go. So in the election of 1800, if you remember, last time we left off with President Adams and how he was having a really difficult time. And so now it is time for a new election. The Federalists go ahead and support Adams for re-election and Charles Pinckney as his vice president. The Republicans wanted Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr as his running mate. Okay. So notice a few things. I didn't highlight everything, but it is interesting that political campaigns were much different back then. They didn't directly campaign themselves door to door. Usually instead they had people writing letters and articles in the newspaper on behalf of the candidate. Okay, although the similarities are still the same in that there were a lot of personal attacks made, and it got pretty nasty, and which unfortunately is still true. Okay, so to make a long story short, if you recall, we've talked about before, the Electoral College is actually the group that votes for the president and vice president, right? And remember that the number of electoral votes the state got were based on the number of senators and representatives you have, right? So in this election in 1800, there was actually a tie in the Electoral College between Jefferson and Burr. So because of that tie, it goes to the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives also was having a big debate. Both Jefferson and Burr are Republicans, right? So the Federalists didn't really want either of them, but they had a hard decision to make, which is like the less of two evils, okay? And so they kept debating about it and voting. They voted 35 times in a row, and they were always kept tying until finally the tie was broken. And I don't know why your book doesn't mention it here, but it was Hamilton who did a lot of the swaying to get the votes to finally change towards Jefferson, which might be surprising, right? Because we know that Jefferson and he had such disagreements, and we had talked about that quite a bit, right? How they were obviously always on the opposite side of things. But he had a lot of personal reasons. He did not think Burr was very upstanding, really stood for anything. He felt like he was kind of wishy-washy, and he also had some personal reasons. He had run against and won and beat his father-in-law, and so he had some bad feelings about that in a previous election. So basically, in the long story short, is that Hamilton thought that even though he disagreed with Jefferson a lot, he at least could respect him as a politician and someone you could trust. Okay. So anyway, it's after this kind of problem again that they decide that, okay, this method really isn't working well. We need to change it so that you don't just vote for top goes to president and second goes for vice president. They decided they were going to change that in 1803. They passed the 12th Amendment. So that was how it is nowadays. Okay, and so we switch over. Jefferson, of course, then is going to be a much different president than the Federalists before him. So he wants to do a lot of limiting. Remember, he didn't like a big federal government, so he is going to do a lot to cut down on the control and power and the size of the government. So, for example, he spends a lot less on the military. He reduces the debt instead of, like, remember, Hamilton was trying to kind of expand and build up more credit. He actually severely limits how many people can work for the government, making it literally smaller. They got rid of a lot of the taxes. The only taxes that really stayed were import taxes. So on imports, we've talked about that before, right? And he also thought the majority of the money for the government were going to come from all those lands that they were selling in the West. Remember, we had talked about how they were auctioning those off. And so he thought that's how most of the money could be made for the government. One interesting thing is right before John Adams left office, I don't know if you remember, but elections take place in November, and then the next person doesn't take over until January. So there was a little time in there where Adams knew he was out, but he still could make a big impact in the sense that he had what they called the Judiciary Act of 1801, where he made hundreds of last-minute appointments of judges, and also he made the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court be John Marshall. So he was trying to put Federalists in power in the in the judicial branch. So even though he himself is out, he's going to make a big impact on a lot of the decisions that are made, and he's picking people that are thinking more like him. This is actually very similar to what Trump is doing now, right, with doing tons of judges appointments, two recently on the Supreme Court. So he is also trying to have a big influence on the judicial branch. So that was all well and good, but unfortunately, these what they call last minute or midnight judges did not get their paperwork. Those papers are called commissions. And so when they came in, Jefferson came in and he had his Secretary of State, Madison, they found these papers and they did not want to deliver them. They figured, okay, well, that's all well and good that you made the appointment, but you didn't finish it, right? The paperwork didn't get sent. And so he wanted to not send it and to be able to put in his own people. So there was a big Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison. So the first name is always the person that is the person suing, and the second one is the person who is being sued, the defendant. So William Marbury was one of these judges that was supposed to have this appointment, and he sued to try to get the Supreme Court to make them give him, deliver his paperwork so he could be a judge. And interestingly, the Supreme Court said, no, I'm sorry, we don't have the power to do that. That's not our job. And what they did is the Chief Justice, John Marshall, wrote up kind of what they thought the Supreme Court's job was, which are called the three major principles of judicial review. So the idea that the Supreme Court's job is to decide if things are constitutional, meaning they agree with the Constitution. So he said, in his opinion, they call it, when he writes up why they decided this, that basically the Constitution is the highest law, and if there's any other laws or decisions that are made that are against the Constitution, then they can declare them unconstitutional, and because the Constitution is the highest. And this is why this court case is so famous, is because it basically defined what the job of the Constitution, what the job of the Supreme Court is, and it really, that's why it's so famous, more than just like, did this one guy, Marbury, get his job or not. Chief Justice Marshall also did a lot. He was around for a long time, 34 years, and they list some other interesting cases here, which we're not going to have time to go into, but it shows that he also kind of made the Supreme Court prove that it's, more powerful and more dominant over states. So, for example, there was one court case there, McCullough, which was talking about how states were trying to tax the federal government. And, basically that was a pretty big case where it shows that, when it comes down to it, the federal government has more power and Congress has more power than the states. So anyway, that is interesting. Here is also, this picture is a picture of Monticello. That is Jefferson's home that he actually designed, and his big plantation was one of the places that we visit when we're in DC. And over here they have a little bit about him. He, as well as being obviously very big in the government, wasn't really obviously architect. He also had a lot of inventions. Some of them you'll see when we're there, and some of them aren't actually totally his idea. There are things he saw in Europe that he tried to recreate or improve on. And so he was a very interesting guy. And also from his plantation, you can see the University of Virginia, which he also started. So that's a big thing. Okay, so that's it for today.